And now, aviation weather around Alaska. Hello, I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska aviation weather outlook as we go into the weekend. For Friday, we have a couple of weather systems we're going to be keeping an eye on. There's going to be an area of low pressure along the northwestern Gulf Coast and also a low back out here toward the west coast, southwest interior. Those two systems will be dominant. There could even be some convection, isolated flashes of lightning, rumbles of thunder along the northern northeastern Gulf Coast Friday morning. And then we have a rather widespread area of IFR conditions extending back through the western southwest interior all the way back up toward the Bering Strait and St. Lawrence Island. For Friday afternoon, things do improve a bit as far as IFR conditions. They relax across areas of the southern mainland. Still some IFR along the intercoastal mountains of the Panhandle, on up toward the central interior along the Yukon River and farther north along the spine of the Brooks Range, especially in through the inner portions of the North Slope. For Saturday, there is going to be a strong low lift out of the North Pacific and an impact the Panhandle with higher winds, at the very least gale force winds, maybe some storm force gusts in a few areas, and along with a round of rain and snow. Some of it could be on the moderate and heavy side. We find a broad area of IFR conditions across the North Slope, Arctic coast, down south of the Brooks Range to just north of the Yukon River. Also another area of IFR conditions along the Kuskokwim River Basin and just west of the Alaska Range. And for Saturday afternoon, again, with the daytime, we find those conditions improve slightly to at least MVFR in areas of the west and north, but still persistent IFR conditions along the Beaufort Sea coastline, especially Utqiagvik to Kaktovik, and then along the North Slope. Also areas just east of Kotzebue Sound and through the western interior, and again along areas of the intercoastal mountains there, of the inner channels of the Panhandle. So past conditions for Friday, we anticipate IFR to hold as you fly north up across the North Slope, but Anaktuvik Pass should see VFR conditions become MVFR. Same thing, Adigan Pass, VFR becoming MVFR, but as you fly farther north, especially there of the north entrance, you'll encounter IFR conditions on Friday. Lake Clark and Merrill start out IFR in the morning, giving way to MVFR. Rainy Pass also IFR giving way to MVFR. And right now it looks like Windy Pass should generally hold on to IFR conditions on Friday, especially along the southern areas, the southern entrance of Windy Pass. Isabel Pass should generally see MVFR conditions. Further east, Mentasta Pass, generally VFR toward the Alcan border, though the south of the south entrance of Mentasta could see MVFR conditions. And Tanita Pass is generally looking to be MVFR throughout the day on Friday. Further south and west there, Portage Pass, IFR conditions in the morning giving way to MVFR. And finally, areas of the northern Panhandle at Chilkoot and White, we expect IFR conditions to hold throughout the day on Friday. Looking at freezing levels, the air mass over Alaska is definitely a colder one. We have the surface freezing line now pushed all the way down to just north of the Aleutian chain across the lower Bering. Coming in along coastal areas of the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, the Kenai, along the northeastern Gulf Coast, in through the inner channels of the Panhandle. Slight bump to 2,000-foot freezing levels aloft there just to the southeast of Haida Gwaii, and then behind me there is another low coming up out of the North Pacific, well southwest of the Aleutians, where freezing levels bump up to 2,000, 4,000, and 6,000 feet. So there's not a lot of warm air aloft. We do anticipate the potential for moderate icing along areas of the northeastern Gulf, areas of the central inner channels, Stevens Passage area of the Panhandle, up back to areas along the central Alaska Range to just north of the Yukon River, above 2,000 feet. Gulf Coast areas above 4,000 feet, and then behind me, an area that is just southwest of the Aleutians, where we have that next frontal system in low approaching above 6,000 feet in some of the precipitation way out there. And then looking at the upper level winds, we have a trough, actually upper level low, sitting here at 30,000 feet. So we have cores of wind within the jet stream above 100 knots, 105 knots here off of eastern Russia, Kamchatka coastline, and also crossing the eastern Aleutians and just south of the Alaska Peninsula. And then those winds curve back up, southwesterly winds upwards to near 100 knots there, northern parts of the Panhandle, and then especially coming on into the British Columbia coast as we bring it down to 700 millibars or 9,000 feet, roughly speaking. We see those core of winds here just off of the British Columbia coast, 50 to near 60 knots. A belt of southwesterly winds as high as 55 knots there just to inside of the northern part of the Panhandle. And then the low circulation, we have this one low that's sitting here at 700 millibars. The northeasterly flow on the backside of it from off the Seward Peninsula to near and past St. Matthew, 40-50 knots, and then another area that extends out here through the western Aleutians out of the northeast upwards of 50 to 60 knots as you get out further down into the North Pacific. And then finally at 3,000 feet, we have the low circulation here over the southwest portion of the mainland, and strong winds of 45 to 60 knots through the Bering Strait, especially along the Russian coastline to the north side of and west side of St. Lawrence Island, falling off to 40 knots as we get down there toward St. Matthew. A broad belt of winds ahead of the Aleutians here on the North Pacific of 45 to 60 knots. And then behind me here, we have another area of winds that are associated with that strong low that's going to be moving up into the Panhandle across Haida Gwaii on Saturday. And we expect winds 50 to as high as 60, 70 knots around this low. So that's going to generate quite a bit of turbulence by Saturday. In the meantime, though, for Friday, some moderate turbulence along the Gulf Coast, surface to 6,000 feet. Some of that spreading inland up along the eastern Alaska Range, surface to 8,000 feet. We find areas of moderate turbulence along the Alaska Peninsula, Kodiak Island, Kuskokwim Bay, surface to 4,000 feet. Also areas surface to 4,000 feet, western Brooks Range, just north of the Yukon River out across the Bering Strait down through St. Lawrence. And as we get down to St. Matthew, surface to 3,000 feet, and then an area of surface to 3,000 foot moderate turbulence out across portions of the western Aleutians.